Just in case this is still unclear to you, we're going to look at each section of that structure. First, question the question. I already went into this, but this is just looking at the question and making sure you understand the full scope. So really understand, what is the product we're making? With the example of design a phone for a blind person, what does it mean to be blind? Is that 100% blind, or is that just 50%? The next one is, what do we mean by phone? Do we want apps and things, or do we just want to be able to call and text? Why are we making this? Do we have any constraints in terms of building it? That's really questioning the question, figuring out why you're building the product and what's the direction you should be going. Don't be afraid, as I've talked about before, ask your interviewer, do you mind if you take a few minutes to think about this before you do anything at all? Usually during this time, I like to think aloud, just be like, all right, so these are my initial thoughts, and that way I can just keep the interviewer engaged instead of being quiet, but that's really just a personal preference. The next step is defining the user. Sometimes this is really easy. Your interviewer tells you, design a phone for a blind person. The user is the blind person. Super easy. Other times they don't, such as invent a brand new desk. Then we don't really know who the user is. In these cases, what we have to do is, what we should do is narrow down the user. You could say, well, we're going to design a desk for everyone. But that's going to be very, very, very difficult to solve. What makes it easier is breaking into smaller pieces. So we're going to design a desk for playing video games, or for standing desks at the office, or for disabled people. And you really want to come up with 3 potential users. Once you come up with the users, you then can narrow down that list and prioritize what's the number 1 user you're going to focus on. You can do this any way you want. The way that I do is based on impact and monetization. Both of these are 2 ambiguous terms, so I typically will explain it to my interviewer. Impact really means, how big of a pain point is this for the user? Or how much, not necessarily the pain point because we haven't gotten there yet, but how much can we make a difference for this user by designing a new desk, such as video game playing? Do they really need a new desk? Do offices really need a standing one? Or what about disabled people? I feel like they could really have a new desk. So focusing on who could you make the impact to and really help the most. The next is monetization. This really looks at, how much money can we make off a product like this? Is the market size big? Would we be able to charge one market more than the other? For example, if you look at mothers and we're potentially designing a product for their child, mothers are going to be more likely to pay than someone who isn't related to someone. Think about how much is someone's willingness to pay. This is kind of where the economics classes come in. And that's what's going to do monetization. And I would write out impact, monetization, and I'd go through each user, and you want to talk about the criteria in which you're waiting on and why you're prioritizing one over the other until we come down to the 1 user that we want to focus on. After you've decided on your user, you're going to want to focus on a pain point for that user to solve. If we were looking at a blind person and using a phone, some of the pain points that would come up are they able to see the buttons? How are they able to know when calls are coming in or calls are going out? How are they able to use text? How are they able to scroll the internet? They're not really able to see the internet. Well, now we've listed a bunch of different pain points that resolve in them seeing. So I think the main pain point would be, how are blind people able to use a touchscreen that's flat and relies on visuals? You kind of want to just think through the different pain points for that potential user group. I like to come up with 3 pain points, but sometimes if you list out a whole bunch, you'll notice a trend and sum them up, kind of like I did there. How are they able to send a text, receive a call? Well, how are they able to read a flat screen if they can't see? Kind of things like that. And that's how we're going to narrow down to 1 pain point. After we have our pain point, we want to come up with a solution for them. And these solutions are going to want to target that pain point. We want to come up with a minimum of 3. Try to make one of them at least like pretty out there and really creative. Because what you'll notice is if you start doing a lot of product interviews and asking the same questions, people are going to come up with very similar solutions. What's going to help you stand out is trying to come up with the best one that's the most out there and the most different and the most unique. It doesn't even really have to be feasible, just the most thought-provoking to show that you're thinking outside of the box. After you have your solutions, this is the prioritization step. We want to look at all 3 solutions and think about which one is going to be the best. You can do this any way you want. The way that I did it was I rated them off 2 criteria. 1, user impact. The next, ease of implementation. And with user impact, what I'm looking at is this solution really going to solve the pain point? And are the users really going to go out of their way to use the solution? Is it going to be worthwhile and help them the most? The next is ease of implementation. Usually it's here I start to discuss with my interviewer. Well, are we going for a quick win or do we want a long-term thing? Does time really matter? And I talk about engineering resources. Well, engineering resources are pretty important. So we should maybe, if one solution is only going to take 3 months to implement, the other one's going to take 4 years, maybe it's better to just do the 3-month one really quick, then move to the 4-year one instead of vice versa. And that's why I talk about the ease of implementing it. And when I look at ease of implementation, you can look at kind of office politics. Will it need to work among different services? 2, the engineering difficulty. And 3, any other factors that may involve implementing the solution. And I would take these 2 factors, and that's how I would narrow down the number 1 solution. Usually after you pick a solution, your interviewer will kind of question you, push back a little, and kind of like argue with you to make sure that you really give a persuasive response and support your argument. At this point, they're either going to ask you what are metrics you would use to measure it, or I think you should go above and beyond and just ask, be like, would you now like me to go into metrics to define the success of this product? And they may, if it's open-ended, I typically would list as many as I could think of off the top of my head. Sometimes they'll say top 3. After you come up with a bunch, they're going to ask you to pick the number 1 metric. And instead of me telling you every single metric, I've included a sheet attached to this chapter that is a list of all the metrics that you're able to pull from. Finally, you are going to talk about launch strategy. None of the books include this. A lot of your interviewers won't even bring it up. This is what you're going to do to go above and beyond. A lot of times, I would ask like, oh, would you like to talk to me kind of how I would launch this product? When you're doing this, you want to think about where you're going to launch it and why. What's your MVP going to look like? What are you going to A/B or split test to really figure out what is the best way to go about things? And just talking about a simple launch strategy about how you build MVP, how would you test this idea, could help you really stand out among the other candidates who aren't going to do this. Because I actually know for a fact that most of the people I did mock interviews never talked about this stage, which is incredibly crucial. You could even talk about going back and just testing all 3 solutions that you had discussed. Now, what I don't want you to do with these questions is to memorize a set formula, because if you try and take every question and put it into that formula, it's going to become very difficult. And that's really what tripped me up on a lot of questions, such as the question, redesign an ATM. I was going through that question and I was super confused. I got halfway. I went from, okay, we're going to focus on industrial shopping complexes like malls, to the pain point is, I can't even remember at this point, but I was just looking at the board. I was just like, wow, this is awful. And my interviewer's face seemed like she agreed. And I just took a step back and I was like, well, actually, let's think about this. Malls aren't going to really use ATMs. So why are you designing an ATM? I think we could think about an entirely new structure to design ATMs, because I think ATMs are going to go out of business. And then we went in a completely different direction and talked about like creating a system where people could just check out with their phone. And because honestly, why do we need an ATM in the future? So question the interviewer. If you get that question asked, like, why are we redesigning the ATM? What's wrong with it? So take a step back and really think about it, because there's not one right format. The only things you really need to like hit on are kind of, who are we targeting when we create this product? So the user, what's the pain point? What are we solving for? And what's the solution? In that problem, I could have just stepped back and be like, all right, well, everyone uses an ATM. ATMs are actually going out of date. So I think the problem is, what's going to be the future of ATMs? Let's think about how we could solve it. But first, let's go back and what are ATMs solving? Well, they help you get money. So how could we help people in the future get money? That's our pain point. Do you see what I mean? And when you try and just take the formula that like circles teach you, it's really confusing and it can throw you off because of it. So I'm going to go through some examples for you to help you better understand these questions. But again, don't necessarily worry about the formula. Just worry about that general structure that I talked about.